Hello, hello, hello. This is a content warning right at the top of the show, so you know it's serious. This episode contains frank discussions about transphobia, transmedicalism, biological essentialism, online harassment, gaslighting, cults, misogyny, transmisogyny, bigotry against gender non-conforming people, one brief mention of domestic abuse, references to Jessica Yaniv, who will be referred to in the show as JY, TERFs, gender-critical people, and general hate group nonsense.
The category is What the Trans, darlings?
Hello, and a very time zone appropriate salutation to you, and welcome to What the Trans.
What the trans? I ate vegetables today and I feel so much better for it.
It's strange how that could work out, isn't it? Yes, I remember you regaling me with tales of your meal, but so is that not something that happens very often then, or?
Not enough these days, because I've been living mostly off ramen and peanuts with the odd handful of frozen vegetables mixed in there, but I think if my mother saw what was happening, she would be ashamed, thoroughly ashamed.
Oh dear.
So sorry, Mum, because I know you're listening to this at some point. I have not been eating my veggies, but I am doubling down and I ate a whole bunch of vegetables just now, and I feel like a new woman. Ashleigh, how is your vegetable intake?
I live with a vegetarian, and even though I am not, or at least in the official sense, I am not a vegetarian, but in the functional and practical sense, I kind of am. It's quite rare that I will eat meat now anyway. So as a result of this, we're cooking together quite a lot. Myself and my housemate, we are, teaming up to make delicious vegetable pies and curries and stews and stuff. And because I'm stuck at home by myself for quite a lot of the time, because she's out as a key worker, I do quite a lot of the baking, actually. And so I'm making a lot of bread and pastry and stuff. I did, I know you kind of live off packaged ramen, but I legit did the whole boil vegetables for several hours on Friday and make a delicious broth, which we then had ramen with the spring onions and the grated carrot and the boiled egg on top. I was putting effort into the appearance as well as the taste. But then some days you just can't be asked, right? And it's just oh, fuck it, whatever's in the fridge, or frozen pizza or something. So yeah, some days are better than others, essentially, is what I'm saying. I'm trying to keep it good. However, I have noticed that with all this baking and good breads and hearty pastries and stuff, I seem to be putting on a bit of weight. So that's interesting. Because I'm not running around the office like a blue-bottomed insect of some kind. I'm sat at home. So
I think everyone is going to be a little bit fuller out, but as the body positivity person that I am, I will say that is absolutely fine, Ashleigh, and you are a gosh darn beauty, regardless of what certain little deposits of fat and stuff may have developed in these most troubling of times.
Very true.
On that body positive thing, let's move to our episode. So this week we are not doing a terrible news because we have a pretty, I would say, special. I think this is technically a special.
I'd say so, although you're right, it does feel a bit strange to describe it that way, doesn't it?
Yeah, because in my travels, I came across two people who identify as agender and as trans, and a trans woman respectively, who have been in the gender-critical movement. You may know them as TERFs, you may know them as radical feminists, but I know a few radical feminists, and they are not fond of that designation being applied to them. But whatever you want to call them, these two people were kind of brought into the fold of a hate movement that hates them. And I found that incredibly interesting. And I think we've all seen your Miranda Yardleys and your Debbie Haytons, who are pieces of work in some ways, but you don't really hear a lot about the people who go into that movement and then come out again. And I thought it was worth giving a whole episode to their story.
And what a conversation it was. And just to reiterate the content warnings that we gave you at the very top of the show, please do take those seriously. This is a very heavy conversation and it covers some very difficult ground. And that might not be something that you are able to listen to. And I'm not sure how quickly I'll be listening to this one back myself, fascinating as it was. Don't think I want to talk it up too much before we play the tape, but the one thing that I will say is that there was some very, very surprising things in this interview, but some tragically unsurprising ones too. So take it away, Us in the Past.
Hello, guests. Would you like to introduce yourselves?
My name is Haven, and I am an agender person. They, them, or she, her pronouns are okay. And I'm also a former gender-critical ally. And I'm here to talk to you about my experiences.
And I'm Asha, and I guess she, her for me. And I am here to, I guess, same thing. I think I was a little more than a gender critical ally for a while. Anyway, we'll get into it.
Welcome to the show, and thank you both for sitting down to talk to us about this, because within this, I think there's kind of a lot of things, well, about like identity and personhood and rights and blah, blah, blah. So this is potentially a very deep discussion, isn't it? So thank you both for joining us for it.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for having me.
So I guess we should start at the beginning. So how did you become involved in the gender critical world?
I guess I could go first. So just to give a little background, I am trans myself. I was assigned male at birth, but I've physically transitioned. I started that about 10 years ago. And at this point, I found that I'm genderless in terms of identity and that I don't have one. But that's just background. So basically, starting off in the community, probably 2013, 2014, I was at first just the problematic, quote unquote, trans, where I didn't believe in like transition without dysphoria, or I didn't believe in kids transitioning. I didn't believe in like non-binary genders or things like that. But I wasn't gender critical. And for a few years, I just didn't talk about these views at all because it got me so much slack in the community. And so I just didn't talk about them. And then about 2 years ago, I had a bit of a falling out with a lot of my social circle because I came out publicly and I said that I don't believe kids should transition and I don't believe in self-ID. And so I said these things publicly, and the trans people in my social circle just completely turned on me. And my former best friend doxed me and blocked me. I was harassed online for about a month by them. It was just horrible. And during that time, I was finding support from a population that in the past did not support me. And that was the gender critical feminists who are at the least trans skeptical, I would say. And many of them were just full on transphobic, anti-trans. But I kind of fell in with that movement for quite some time. And because of my philosophical views at the time, since I was a modernist and I was a post-positivist in terms of philosophical standpoint, and that basically implies that objective reality is what it is and people's feelings don't matter. It's just what science can detect. So what the gender critical movement was saying to me was like, it made a lot of sense in terms of my worldview at the time. Like, men and women are physical categories based on biological sex that can be objectively measured, and gender roles are just imposed by society. So that's basically how I fell in with it. Sorry, I'm rambling.
No, you're absolutely fine. You're absolutely fine. Asha, what about you? How did you get into the fold?
A little differently. I'm a little bit late. I didn't start transitioning until I was 31. And I started for a little bit different reasons, I think, than a lot of people that I've to. So it kind of came into this sideways, and I just ended up more or less, I'd had some trans friends, right? And I'd had a lot of things in my head that I was really hard in denial, right? And when I finally came out to myself, it was because I was sick and I I had come up with this theory that hormones would help me heal from what it was I was sick with. I still am, but it's much better. Anyway, when I tried them and they worked, it made such a difference that it was like, okay, I'm going to be on this forever. So there's something real about this. There's something really real. Like, this is a thing. So yeah, and I was reading at the time. I was starting to actually really start to research. And I was reading Cindy Jones, and I was on gender analysis, just really, really comprehensive. And I was reading a lot of trans stuff because I thought, like, if anyone's going to talk about it, it's going to be trans people, right? They're the ones who are going to know what the fuck they're talking about because they are the ones experiencing it, right? But I was also going through a lot of really intense personal stuff because I wasn't just coming out as trans. I was also like, fuck it. If I'm going to come out as this, I'm going to tell people that I prefer men as well. I'm going to tell like people all these things. And I was I just had no tether. I was really, really out of it. And I didn't know what to think. I'm just like, my whole world sort of exploded at once and I didn't know what to think. So I ended up on Reddit. And then I started looking for some way to understand myself, some way to explain myself, to feel like I have a connection, like a community. And I started asking questions. And that got me banned off Ask Transgender on Reddit. And I was like, well, okay. So I ended up on a debate forum. And somehow over time, I kept feeling like people were so sure about this thing. And I guess I just felt...
By debate forum, you mean like gender critical versus trans people?
Yeah, it's that one. It's GC versus QT, I think is what it's called. GC debates QT.
I didn't know that I was referring to a specific group. I've seen those kind of groups around is all. I didn't know the specific name of this one.
Yeah, and that actually on there, that's where I started looking up for different types of things, and that's sort of where I encountered Blanchard.
Ray Blanchard.
Yes, and then I went down that rabbit hole trying to figure out where I fit in that, and like I think a lot of us have figured out, like it just didn't, and I didn't know where to go from that.
Yeah, I think I'm a type B, as in, boyish, but I'm supposed to come out as a trans lesbian, but I actually like men. Like, I don't fit into it at all.
I mean, the whole thing about Whispers and his nonsense is that it doesn't make sense at all for anybody. And so to say that, I don't quite fit into that category. Well, of course you don't. It was his bullshit category that he came up so he could easily categorize trans people and deny them healthcare.
I would say that I know people who feel that it does describe them and it does help them. So I can't say for anybody. If it's helpful for some people, great. And if it's not, great. I don't think anybody should be forced into the categories or whatever. And I also think that it's like a tiny bit of what those people who do identify with it experience. The point is I went down that rabbit hole and got myself really lost in that for a number of years. And sorry, this is going to take a while because it's complicated.
You're okay. Take your time.
So also, when I was growing up, I had some difficulties. I grew up in a really, really intensely strict religious cult, like an actual cult. So we were about 150 people, and it was very Calvinist, mixed with Jung, mixed with Catholicism. I don't know what it was, but it was like we had a cult leader, and he was the only one who could like understand what God wanted and all of that, right? We used to drive 2 hours to the woods to church, windy roads in the middle of the woods. So it was like a cult. And I have a trans person in my family. My aunt is trans, and my mom and her did not get along very well when that happened. So early on in my childhood, I had a lot of shame from just being really young and being like, oh God, I can't tell her that I'm like this, because she used to talk some really, I guess, trigger warning stuff where it was like just the usual, like the mutilation and how we're basically like living suicides and stuff like that. And then I met my aunt when I was around 8, and it was a very awkward experience. And it's just that my aunt wasn't really cognizant, I think, of other people and their boundaries in certain ways. And that really drove that point home to me. And so young me was like, whoa, I cannot do this. I will not do this. I cannot be like this. And so I really, really strongly was like I actually promised my mother I would never, so like 8 years old, I'm like, Mom, I swear I will never do this. I promised her 3 times, and I held on to that for a really long time because until it like became necessary. So there was that side. And then, so anytime I saw behavior that was really pushy, or that I like identified as like really pushy in the trans community, then I had a way of feeling it made me really uncomfortable. It made me feel like this isn't okay because you're going to make people feel the way that like my mom felt and the way that that communicated to me. So I had a lot of really intense internalized trauma feelings to do with that. And my mom was a wonderful person. I don't want to say that she did anything bad. Like, she had no idea. And this was between her and another person, and I was just extrapolating. And then, so I had some frustrations with people that I knew in the trans community, and I started airing them on Twitter because I felt their behavior was frustrating. And obviously I was also really worried about my family and trying to maintain things with my family. And so basically I just wanted to make sure that I made sense and that they felt that I wasn't becoming someone else, and like the whole thing. And so I started venting about that on Twitter, and I got picked up by people, and then all of a sudden I was getting a lot of followers, and then it just sort of snowballed.
So it sounds like there's a sort of a similar story where there were disagreements with other members of the trans community, and in they swooped with love, I guess. I mean, is that accurate?
Kind of.
Pretty much. And for me, it was basically like, love bombing is kind of an overused term, but that's basically what it was. I had people, commenting on my posts, saying how beautiful I was, how intelligent I was, how much better I am than the trans community or the trans people that they've interacted with. And as someone with training in psychology, I would have figured that it would have had no effect on me, but it did have an effect on me. And it made me feel as though that was my community, that was where I belonged, because these people were wanting to turn me into an ally, but at the time it seemed like that's what they wanted. And that was basically my experience with it. And like many other people in this situation, I also came from a fundamentalist family. I was raised in the independent fundamental Baptist movement, which is essentially a cult. And I left that movement when I was a teenager, and then left organized faith entirely a few years after that. But it still has scars on me. As a child, I was told that I was an abomination, that my natural personality, since I've always had a very, feminine personality, which might not make sense to some people because I don't identify as female. It's complicated. So I am physically a trans woman. I had dysphoria. I have physically transitioned, and it has gotten rid of my dysphoria. So that's part of me. But in terms of how I identify, how I feel, how I think of myself, it's always as genderless. But none of that mattered to my family as a child or to my church. Anything LGBT was an abomination. And my parents wanted to send me to conversion therapy when I was a teenager, but fortunately I managed to get out of it. Sorry, I'm rambling again. There was just so much ground to cover in so little time. But with this complicated journey of mine with gender, I didn't think Blanchard could describe it because, again, Blanchard focuses on people who were born biologically male, who identify as female. And that's I've never identified as a woman or as a man or as anything else. But in terms of his typology, I would fit more so of the so-called HSTS, except I'm not attracted to men. I'm completely asexual. And so finding Blanchard's typology was part of my journey as problematic trans and eventually GC. But it was also, it caused me to start to question a few things because I did not fit. And I knew a few other people who just did not fit. But ultimately what kept me in the GC movement was the sense that I was accepted, and also the sense that I was helping women out. Since I was raised in a very patriarchal household, in a very patriarchal church, women were basically seen as baby incubators.
Yeah, they were like a second step up from children, right?
Yes, exactly. Men are the heads of the household, women submit to the man and all of that. And even as a kid, I found that disgusting. Mm-hmm. And so I saw the gender critical movement as a way to fight sexism, as a way to support women. Mm-hmm. And that was what finally hooked me. If I were part of this movement, if I were an ally for it, if I believed in gender critical, theories of sex and gender identity and gender and all of that, then I would be fighting sexism. I would be helping women. I would be allying with women. And that's what sold me.
Actually, I agree. I totally know what you're talking about. And I had a lot of those feelings, but my reasons for being on the GC side were a little, or at least I told myself they were different. I don't know how subconsciously, if they were the same, but I felt a little like I was, like, the reason that the behavior bugged me, or the reason that like trans behavior bugged me in my head, was because I was concerned that society as a whole was going to backlash on trans people. So I wasn't actually like basically I saw a pattern developing, like a larger social pattern developing. And I thought, okay, when we move along in society, when we're trying to bring new values into things, they sort of work in a generational way. The old generation that has like a prejudice or a set of values that isn't really like good with something has a tendency of not changing all that much, but the generation below them or the generation below, they have that more of a tendency to change. And if you try to push a particular generation a little too far, too fast, it's a little bit like, I don't know if you ever made a paper airplane when you're a kid, but this is the example I like to use is if you make a paper airplane and you throw it straight up in the air, you can get like a lot of height really fast, but then it crashes and it nosedives and it crumples and it ruins your plane. And I was really, really worried that's what was going to happen with trans rights. I thought if we keep pushing this behavior, if we keep doing all this stuff, then maybe we're going to crash and burn. And so how do I fix that? And I thought, like, I was worried enough that I felt like, okay, so maybe this is just a problem of language. And also, I just want to say, I'm communicating from my thought patterns at the time, not necessarily what I think it feel now. And I just want to make that clear.
We can put a disclaimer out now saying, talking about the past, which is very different from now.
From a past perspective. And so, yeah. So my feeling was like, okay, what do I do? How do I fix it? Right? Because I didn't feel like I could just not try. Like, I didn't want to become part of what I felt the problem was. And I did think, and also kind of like Haven said, I really felt like, yeah, I'm transitioning into a woman and I identify with women's rights. And I've seen what happens when certain elements of like the patriarchy are put into effect when they're really in effect. Like I remember, well, actually I won't get into it, but I saw a lot of stuff. Actually, I mean, one time I saw my dad like spanked my mother and put her to bed in front of us at the dinner table.
Wow.
Yes, like a child, over something innocuous. So to me,
that's ridiculous.
I don't know what to say to that, so I'll say nothing. I don't know what else to do.
Well, we were sitting at the table, and I think my little brother burped, and my dad was like, "Don't burp at the table," and he got mad at it. And then my dad burped, and my mom was like, "Hey, if you're gonna make a rule, you should follow it," and that pissed my dad off.
Horrible.
It sounds like both of you have come from very, I mean, there's no other way to say it, very traumatic backgrounds. And it's interesting that you both seem to have so much crossover in your stories that left you vulnerable. And from what I've read of cults, it sounds similar to how they recruit. Like, this is what the gender critical people did to you. Would you say that's accurate? I mean, I have no lived experience of cults, but the finding vulnerable people, showing them love, showing them acceptance, making them feel involved in a community and giving them a purpose.
Yes. For me, I would say yes, but let Asha finish.
Thank you. I was going to say that in a way it was not as much their love bombing for me as much as it was their consistency of idealism. So if you look at the trans community, there's a really big, it's a mess is what it is, right? Because you have like your true scum and you have your, to use the slur that everybody uses for everybody else, right? Like, but you have people who are just very open about it. It's really overwhelming. And so there's a little bit of difficulty in really finding where you fit in that, especially if you're someone like me who just is interested in what people feel and think. Whereas with the gender criticals, there is some of that split, but it's all very, very focused around this core belief that's simplistic enough and based on a sort of absolutist perspective that's easy to understand. And also there's a combination with that is also that they bring out a lot of negative examples, right? And those negative examples really, really fit with what I had seen personally when I was growing up. So like, yeah, so that kind of fit with the prejudice that I already had. And so it took a long time and I had to get to know a bunch more trans people to move away from what I was aware of the reality being. If that makes sense.
That makes sense. And for me, it definitely felt like cult recruitment because that's basically what my church taught us to do with perspectives for them, is to show them love and get them in and then share the full message with them after they've already committed. And that's basically what happened with me and in GC. Like, I got in and I was there for the poor woman post, and the post about, like, oh, it's okay for assigned male at birth people to, wear dresses, and it's okay to be a feminine man and all of that. And that message kind of resonated with me. But eventually, after being in, there was kind of like this underbelly, this side of GC that they don't want to talk about with outsiders because it would get them labeled as bigoted. But the whole, like, seeing GC people who I followed, who I supported, who I thought were good people, like, making fun of trans women simply for being trans women, making fun of transitioners who didn't perfectly pass, making fun of gender nonconforming people, and, like, celebrating people who detransition and who fit into society's gender norms for their sex at birth. And I fully support people who detransition. If you start the process and you feel like this honestly isn't for you for whatever reason, it's perfectly okay to go back. I support that completely. And I'm there for detransitioners. But the way that this was done, it wasn't so much about supporting detransitioners. It was about using detransitioners as a way to support this patriarchal, old-fashioned, rigid gender binary, where people born with, male genitalia have to uphold at least some standard of masculinity, and people born with, female genitalia had to uphold some standard of femininity. And at that time, questions started up for me, like, is this really just a conservative movement? Are these people really feminist? Are they really out here trying to support freedom of self-expression for everyone, equal rights for women and women's spaces and all of that? It felt like they were just pushing this really just conservative view of sex and gender. And that's what started raising a lot of questions for me, was just finding that even though they said that they were progressive and that they had women's interests in mind first, and that they also supported, gender nonconforming people, feminine men, trans people, which they consider to be the same thing as GNC, which later on I found doesn't really work as a concept. But all of that, I just started to see more and more of this right-wing patriarchal viewpoint in GC circles, and it really started to make me feel like I was an abomination simply for being myself, because, like, people were straight up suggesting therapy. I'm not going to use any loaded political language because that's not what I'm here to do, but they were suggesting that anyone who had transitioned or who was currently trans or who was even gender nonconforming could go through therapy to make them okay with their body and with gender roles assigned to them at birth. And basically I was having people, like, not saying it directly to me, but saying it about people like me, that we need therapy to make us good old masculine men. And that was just like, it felt like a knife in the heart, because that was the same kind of stuff I heard from my dad, who was like the super right-wing cult member. And it just really made me think. What finally did it for me, though, with leaving the GC movement entirely, was the one time when I spoke up against that kind of right-wing viewpoint. So some GCs were posting on Twitter that they believe that all transitions should be banned and that people should instead get therapy to help them fit with their sex assigned at birth and with the gender roles that come with that sex. And to be entirely fair to the GC side, the gender roles that they were talking about are not like women stay home in the kitchen and scrub, but like basically women wearing quote unquote women's clothing, men wearing quote unquote men's clothing, and basically just having some relation to society's idea of masculinity and femininity. And so I basically spoke out and I said that I get that there might be issues with transition. I get that we shouldn't have, kids transitioning or people with like severe mental illnesses or things like that. But when it comes to transition itself, bodily autonomy for me is the bottom line. I'm happier this way. I'm happier with my body the way that it is. And I was called basically every single name in the book. I was called a misogynist man. I was called a sexist dude, a hairy, man in a dress. And things that I'm not going to say here because they involve, swear words and really disrespectful language. But I was just attacked. I was blocked for simply questioning this idea that all transition should be banned. And I was also gaslighted. No, they didn't say that. They weren't saying that all transition is banned. I show screenshots. Those aren't real. And I'm like, these are screenshots. Like, just look at the accounts. The posts are still there. Shut up.
What I love about these people is that they make the point that they are like, men should be able to wear dresses and be feminine men, and it's fine. But then when somebody shows up with very classically masculine features and they wear feminine clothes, they're the first to mock them, which is bizarre.
Indeed. Even if they're not trans, like even people like Jeffree Star.
I think there's an important point to be made here, is that they only jump in and wreck this person if they say that they identify as a woman or if they say that they identify as non-binary. If a person in a beard and hair and stuff goes out and wears a dress, like your regular cross-dresser, whatever, right? Like a person who is non-trans, then they're completely behind that, right? So they'll spend a lot of time angrily mock trans women and calling them fetishists. But when an actual fetishist, a person who does not identify as trans and who goes around cross-dressing and things like that, comes out, then they're completely in support of that. And they will laud that person as being like some kind of hero for identifying as a man. That was my only interjection. I just wanted to point that out, that like it really has everything to do with their definition.
That hasn't been my experience because, yes, many GCs are like that. I would venture to say that most GCs have that attitude. Whereas if someone is male and they have masculine features and they wear a dress and they don't identify as trans, then they're okay with it and they actually celebrate it. That makes sense to me. But there are a small minority in the GC community, and it's a very vocal one, who is even against that and who even say that that's woman face and that's a man dressing up to mock a woman.
Face.
Yeah, it's the same ones that hate drag queens. Oh, man.
Yes, it's those people, and they do exist in the GC communities.
Yeah, I've seen them.
Yeah.
We have, yeah. We've kind of seen that impulse from people here in the UK, from specifically the people that are involved with and follow the LGB Alliance. Like it is quite specifically LGB Alliance. And they say, oh, no, we absolutely support gender nonconformity. You know, if you want to screw around with what clothes you're wearing, then great, absolutely. But then when somebody actually does that, it is usually dragged on Twitter, and the people that support and follow this organisation seem to be mostly, well, really homophobic as well as really transphobic. And there was something that I've said at a couple of events that I've spoken at, which is that you scratch a transphobe and you'll find a racist. And there's so much crossover, essentially, particularly with some of the well-known ones here in the UK. It's like, you know, they've come out as some transphobic thing in some way, and then later on it's revealed that they are also a massive racist and homophobe and actually have quite retrograde ideas about women voting or whatever. So it's just interesting to see that that's clustered
in defense
together.
of the GC community, I just wanted to say this, is that these people are the minority. Most GCs that I've interacted with, like even after I kind of left that movement, I wouldn't say that they were necessarily homophobic or racist or anything like that. This movement is a big tent. And it has a lot of different people and a lot of different ideas. And some are just sincerely feminists who hold to a biologically essentialist view of what sex and gender are. And they really do mean well. But there are those who are simply MAGA types who just use GC as a way to seem forward-thinking while at the same time pushing these really right-wing, backward ideas.
Trying to get some of those in our own Parliament right now. We've been reporting on that a lot, but that is for another day.
Indeed.
Probably for...
That's a whole other episode.
Yeah. So after you arrived into the GC scene, Asha, what was it that you saw there, and what was it that made you start to think twice?
So I think I said before that like I felt like I couldn't go in without trying to solve the problem. Like I felt like there was a problem with the trans community, and then we're going to a problem. And my initial sort of idea of what that problem was had a lot to do with language. I thought it was just a problem of, well, okay, they're just using this different word to describe the same thing. And there's really no reason, I thought, to fight over just a word. Like, I could totally give ground. We'll give ground on just this one word, and then that'll be fine, right? Like, then we can come to an accord, and that would work. And it took me a little while to realize that there was more to it, because I was giving them a lot of leeway. But I ended up putting together a sort of organization called Transrational. And the idea was to create a center ground, because strategically my thought was this, like, if you have these two sides coming together, if you could create like a center ground, then maybe I could slow down the upward rise of things enough where it would even out, and then even it out. And I believed what I was saying, those things, right? And I thought that taking this stance, taking this thing was necessary. And so
it sounds like you started Transrational as some kind of maybe self-defense. Would that be right? Like, you saw that there was an oncoming backlash to what you refer to as pushy trans people. And am I getting the wrong end of things? Because that happens. I get the wrong end of things all the time.
I'm very Aquarius, so I guess I sort of have a tendency. Maybe it was self-defense, or maybe it was a projected sense of trans people as a whole, because I care, and I have from the start. Like, I've had trans friends for a long time, and I cared about them, and I cared about our rights, and it wasn't a situation where I felt like we should have rights taken away or any of that. It was trying to find a balance, because I also cared about women's rights, having seen sort of the same sort of thing that I think people who are really angry about the patriarchy see. Right? I sort of grew up around that, and so that made me really sensitive to that. So having both of these things, I didn't know how to balance them, and I was really worried about where trans people were going. But I also thought that if I don't call this out, if I don't criticize some of these things, then they're not going to see that trans people are sane, rational people, quote quote, who are willing to call out bad behavior in their own side. Does that make sense? Because it was an attempt to. I was actually attempting to speak to trans people and not to GCs. But then the GCs were just the people who followed me, and then I became more or less influenced by them. And so when I started Transrational, I thought that the right way to get this decision would be to have people from every side. So like have like a man who's into GC, some women who are into GC, some trans women and some trans men, and just get everybody together. If I could find people who would be willing to hash this stuff out without hating each other on a personal level, like if we could just disagree politically, and this was very idealistic, because that is not how it worked out. Yeah, that is not how it worked out. And so what ended up happening was I made it, and I found people who were good with that, but we began to clash on internally on silly things. I'd be like, could you just not use the word mutilated? And then, the GC woman would be like, well, why are you trying to control what I'm saying? That's very like, the patriarchy is always trying to control what I'm saying. And I'm like, you are offending people and making it difficult for us to have a discussion about the actual issues. So right now, your right to piss everyone off is like, I'm not trying to control your speech, but like, we need to tone it down a little bit. Like, you get mad when we use words that you don't like. You should have the same courtesy for us. And it sort of like went like that. And a lot of times we got some stuff done, but then we eventually wrote the Transrational Manifesto, and I built a website. I started making videos, and then I crowdfunded a trip to the UK. And I went to the UK, and I met a lot of the people there. So I met Jane Clare Jones, and I met Helen Joyce, and I met things. And they were actually really, really kind to me, a lot of them. And some people that I met, I really didn't get along with. Other people I really did get along with. And as human beings, too. Like, there's some people that I really still have a lot of, like, respect for. Some of them turned on me and lost it actively. But, they sort of revealed, I would say, the true face of what they were really about. And that was painful. But I think ultimately as my views changed, so as I was doing Transrational, the more I really got into the GC views, the more I felt that I changed. And I think part of that was because I was trying to have a balanced discussion. And the GC people sort of bullied the other trans people out, and trans people just quit, and this is people that were on the trans side just got out, and they exited, and they couldn't handle the bullshit. And so I think we actually talked a little bit back then.
I did with you.
Yeah. Before then, and I think we had because I had some really like intense, like fundamental disagreements, and the disagreements were not about necessarily like my disagreements with trans ideas and their ideology and stuff was not about the actual ideas. It was about whether or not society would be able to adopt them in a way that wouldn't make them so angry.
I think that was the thing that I fundamentally disagreed with a lot of GC trans people is that I've talked to. That is a very common thread that kept coming up, that
trans people are being too loud, too pushy, it's too much. It's going to make people say, oh no, this is too much. And it's going to create a backlash. And I absolutely understand the root of that concern because there's almost a constant backlash to the very existence of the trans community. And so, yeah, Right.
So it feels like if you go overboard, then it's going to destroy us. And that's what I'm really worried about. Like how are we going to have social acceptance if... Right, so that was the thing, and I thought that the way to work against that would be to call out those problems and to be like, no, okay, these are problems, and we should talk about it, and we should fix it, right? I was seeing a lot of the villains, I guess you could call them, of the trans community, JY and various other people, and a lot of that was really...
It's always the same three fucking people.
Well, JY was the one I started calling out more than... I was one of the first people to start calling out JY, which is... That's the platform that I made my platform on that in a way. Anyway, I made this thread that got really, really popular really, really fast. It had 700 or 800 likes when I had like a 50 follower account, and it put me up to 300, 400 followers. And then after that,
and they were all GC followers.
They were all GCs, and I got blocked by trans people almost immediately. So I got forced into a bubble really, really fast, and so that was kind of problematic.
See, the thing I think is that this is not the first time a minority has faced this particular kind of appeal for acceptance. I mean, there was the people who, in the civil rights movement, which is a very different thing, but they were saying that Martin Luther King Jr. filling up the cells, protesting, marching, that was being too in your face, and if they were just quiet, they would wait. And the fact that he wrote about that specifically in his letter from Birmingham jail, and the same with the suffragettes asking for too much, they were being too loud, and there were some that wanted to try and work within the system. Is that, and I think that is kind of where, and if I'm full of shit, absolutely call me out for it, but it feels like, based on your stories, both of you were filled with shame very early on in your life in very traumatic ways, so you were trying to make peace and help. Like, your intentions were good, but then you got sucked into this world that primarily seems to hate gender variance at its core. Have I got the right end of the stick? If there's anything I've got wrong, please correct me.
In the past,
yeah, no, that sounds about right.
I have always been a gradualist in that I thought that social change had to happen gradually. People from the marginalized group needed to earn the acceptance of the majority. And so I found like the behavior of many trans activists to be off-putting because of that, because I just believed in gradualism with all my heart. And after this experience, and after just sitting down and talking with these quote-unquote social justice warriors that I had dismissed for a long time, I was basically finding that there were a bunch of marginalized people and allies who just were finding that the gradualist approach just wasn't working, and they were tired of waiting and asking politely to be treated like a human being. They wanted equality, and they wanted it now. And it hit me that this side that I had dismissed as like the wrong side of history, the so-called SJWs and the trans activists and the extreme, leftists and all of the people who I had dismissed, that we fundamentally didn't want different things. It was just that the methodology was fundamentally different. And also, I found, though, that once the GC community kind of spit me out, once I shut down my Twitter account and I went dark for a long time, the people who were showing me real love, acceptance, and care, not for political gain, not to get me to join a movement, not any of that, just they accept me for who I am as Haven. They wanted to see me happy. The people who felt that way were all quote unquote social justice warriors. They were all from that community, like the trans activist SJW, left-wing community that was just about acceptance of me, like not in spite of me being trans, but because of it, because that's part of my journey and that's part of who I am. But at the same time, they weren't reducing me to just that. They were still seeing me as a complete person. And that was something that I found that I just never really got from the GC community. Like, yes, I was accepted because I identified as a man. I disidentified as being trans. I said it's okay to call me he. Like, I tried to kind of walk the line in between full feminine presentation at the time and something that would be a bit more acceptable to GCs. And I just, even when I was being love bombed, it was like, oh, you're this cute feminine guy who just saw through the BS. I mean, yeah, that's not a hateful statement, but it's not who I am. And once I had left GC and once I had questioned biological essentialism enough, once I had questioned, modernism and positivism philosophically, once I had questioned those enough, and I'd come to the standpoint of basically finding that the trans activists did have some valid points, and the postmodernists had some valid points, and people against biological essentialism had some valid points. Once I was able to get to that place, I was able to more fully accept myself. Because at the start of this podcast, I had mentioned that I was agender, and from a GC standpoint, that was something that I never could have explored, let alone accepted. Like, I was just a binary man who was binary feminine, and that was how I had to spin it if I wanted acceptance from that community.
That's so strange to me, because in the UK there was a trend for a while that gender-free transphobes were just basically saying that to try and make a really shitty point about how they come under the trans umbrella, but they didn't know that agender people were already sort of in the gender variant community.
And it's just like, it's such a poor attempt at trolling, because these people, they honestly talk about how they feel connected to being a man or to being a woman, and that's just not what an agender person feels. But I was always like, both pre-GC as quote-unquote true scum, and after being a GC ally, I finally got to a point of just saying, like, the whole reason why I don't have a gender identity and why most trans women do is that I'm not just a trans woman. Like, if your definition of trans women is an assigned male at birth person who, takes female hormones and who has surgery to as close to female as is scientifically possible, then yes, I would be a trans woman. But in terms of identifying as a woman, for me, I never understood what that even meant. And when most people talked about, oh, my identity as a woman and they're taking away my identity, I thought it was just political noise, because that's what my community told me it was, and that's what my own experience told me it was, because I never had this identity. But once I was able to step away, I was able to get to this point of saying that gender identity is not just this patriarchal thing that's foisted on the people. It's something that a lot of people have said that they're born with, and a lot of people have said that it's innate and that it's important to them. And I just got to a point of accepting this. And part of this acceptance was recognizing that I was different, that I didn't have that. And finding the label of agender, I would say, wasn't that big of a deal, because I had already known about it. But to really sit with it and take an honest stock of myself, just saying this is what I am, as much as it would be convenient for me to just say that I'm a woman and just live life that way, use she pronouns, and just pass as cis to the world. It just resonated with me, like this label of agender and this truth of just never having a gender identity, not having one, accepting that part. It opened up new parts of myself. It took away pain that I didn't even know I even had. Because like once I physically transitioned, my sex dysphoria went away. So it's not like I had that kind of pain. I don't have dysphoria anymore. I used to. But I still felt uncomfortable in a way that I couldn't put my finger on, a way I couldn't define. And finding this agender term and accepting that this is what I am, that I don't have a gender identity, and that, yes, I am in a body that people perceive as being female, and I present in a way that people perceive as being feminine, and I'm fine with that. But ultimately, what I am is a genderless human being. And once I got to this place of acceptance of that, and acceptance of this complication of gender and sex, that it's not just this black and white, male or female biological essentialism that gender criticals hold to. The real world of it is messy and it's complex, and it involves layers of identity and socialization and performance and so many other things.
Yeah, I don't even know where to start. It's just my gender identity has been there since forever, my whole life. It is that, my brain, my love of certain things, they've been there right from the start, and I don't have any other way to explain it. That's just me, and it's there. When it came to you finally deciding to leave the GC movement, what was it that got you there?
I got cancelled.
Cancelled by GC people?
Yeah, I disagreed with them on some fundamental things. I'm not a swerf, and I disagreed, and I tried to put out some ideas, and they really didn't like it, and then they went nuts, and of them just piling on, taking tweets out of context and making screenshots and taking private messages out of context, telling everyone that, I was a bad person now, and none of that isn't what did it to me. It was that when I realized that people that I really respected, people I had trusted, because I'd listened to a lot of people and their perspectives, right? And I really trusted them. When they had that take on me, and they were so determined to take it in bad faith, when they were looking, like actively trying to ferret out anything that would prove to them that I was every negative thing that they could see, when it was so obvious that you could just get what I was saying by just trying to use a good faith interpretation of it. And when they pulled that, it changed everything, because then I was like, well, how much are they doing this to everyone else? If this is how bad they're getting me wrong because they want to get me this wrong, wait a minute.
I think every trans person listening will have a story just like that, with an encounter on Twitter with someone who is just like, I'm just going to twist everything you say to make you sound like a sex offender as much as possible.
Yeah, no. They were calling me a rape supporter. And
how is that?
And I'm just like,
a rape supporter?
Kidding me?
Really?
Right. I know. So anyway, let's spawn this next thing where someone who was a friend of mine at the time, someone I really, really trusted, and I was just like, look at what she's doing, and then look at what these people are doing to me, and look at what I'm not doing to them. And then she took that as a way of saying, you're a threat. And so then she turned and tried to spin that as something else. And then these things that I said, if I had been female, if I said them, if I was born female and was GC, then there would have been a lot of leeway for that. It would have been like a completely different reaction. I mean, they'd have been mad, but they wouldn't have done the same sort of thing. And I began to sort of peel away the prejudice of it, because there's we need boundaries, but because people aren't going to allow us to have boundaries. And you're like, well, you're not allowing other people to have boundaries. And if you refuse to respect other people's boundaries and other people's ideas and create a compromise, then you are doing what it is that you were saying is wrong with the world. And you're not practicing what you're preaching, and so I lost my respect for them. and a lot of that came from feminist history, just learning about like the way the suffragettes worked, learning about all that stuff. I began to realize that what I was doing had been giving power to my takes were clearly not like the most powerful things in the world, but they had some kind of bite, or I wouldn't have been able to make as much of a leeway as I was. And I should say I was able to make certain leeway, but the leeway that I was making was lending power to the side that was fighting against our rights and our fighting against what it was in our best interests. And so I began to realize that when it comes to like the long-term strategy like this, maybe you just push. Maybe that is what you do. Maybe you just keep fighting. But I don't know where the boundaries are. I don't know where to fight. I don't know how far to go. And I don't know.
I can tell you mine, if that might help. It's what I've been operating on under the last 5 years as a journalist. Every time I've looked into a gender critical theory, concept, any of the statistics they float around, like the 84% of trans youngsters who desist, I've looked into it, I've dug into the data, and I've never found a single compelling point. There is always something they've twisted, every single time. So I stick to the truth. So that's where I come from with my activism, I guess, although I come from it as a journalist, as first and foremost, and sometimes comedian when I get the chance. But most of the time, it's just looking for facts and finding out that almost all of the things that they say just are fundamentally untrue. Does that make sense? That's my form of activism.
And one thing I have not done is I have not gone through and looked at the details or all these facts totally myself. I've seen some data, but I'm not really a numbers person, and I know that people see these different worldviews, and I listen to their worldviews and sort of take that as what they believe, and then sort of mesh them together into my understanding of what people do believe. I don't actually believe anything or disbelieve anything. Does that make sense? I sort of suspended disbelief in a more or less permanent manner. And suspended my belief at the same time. So I'm just taking in information and trying not to put too much stock behind it. I don't want to build a worldview that's going to get... Because I don't know. I don't know who's got what thing. And for me, as a storyteller, it's, as an artist, it's a lot more useful for me to do that than it is for me to be more of a fact checker. And so instead of going into politics, I'm getting out of that, just getting into storytelling because that is my lane. That is my forte, and that makes more sense for the way that my mind works than trying to be an activist.
Well, that's the thing with this kind of stuff. You've got to pick the kind you can do, and you don't owe the trans community anything. I mean, there is something to be said for serving your community, which is something I believe in and something I'm trying to give back to because it has helped me so much. But if you just want to vanish, show up for a few trans club nights, a few socials and prides and stuff, then go back to your life, that's totally fine too. Or if you want to be on the front line with placards and shouting at politicians, that is cool too. It's a very personal decision how involved you are in the fight.
Yeah, and I mean, for me, I'm definitely involved, but it's more a story. Like I'm writing right now. I'm working on a graphic novel. Like I'm about halfway through the second draft of the script for it. So, but I want to do it in a way that isn't about. I feel like what I want to do is represent multiple perspectives rather than trying to like sit in one. And I just want to represent them and some of our struggles and the things that we go through in a way that's less base, but also still poignant. I figure like, storytelling is the way to do that, and that's what I'm good at. So I'm just going there. And so I'm shifting out of activism or politics in general and hopefully moving forward.
So it sounds like you've made peace with where you've been. How do trans people who may be vulnerable avoid going into the gender critical scene? Because it sounds like...
I don't know.
It sounds very toxic from what you and Haven have said. It sounds...
Yeah, it really is. It's like being a woman in the room of men who are constantly talking about how crappy women are. And then they turn every once in a while and say, oh, but not you. You're okay. So it's a really toxic environment. It's really, really toxic for mental health. And that's really like a point of it where you're like, well, if it's this toxic for your mental health, and if the things that you say create feelings in yourself and in others that make you feel that bad, then perhaps there's more to the picture than just the absolute fact of the thing. Maybe it's just a small piece of a larger puzzle. If you hone too much in on the black, you're gonna miss the whole picture, the white and the black moving together, I guess. I don't know that people can avoid it. To answer your original question, I don't know that people can. There's no way that I could have avoided it. I think the stronger question is how to get out of it. Is how do we talk to people who are in it? How do we treat them? And how do we find a way to explain to them, to show them, I guess, that what they're in is toxic for them faster than I think it was shown to the rest of us. And I don't think that being angry or I don't think that intense emotions are going to be helpful for that, because it just gives us something to fight about. And the thing is, like, after I left, I've seen other people sort of rise up and take the place I was trying to take. And so it's been really interesting to watch that swirl. And there seems to be like a steady number of a sort of gender critical leaning trans people that are open about it. And when one leaves, another one takes their place. There's only so many people that are going to do it at a certain time. It's not growing, right? It's not really shrinking, but it's not really growing either, which I think is kind of interesting.
From my monitoring of it, that seems to be very accurate, because there seems to be maybe 6 months to a year someone will get in, stay in, and then burn out. Or, as I would like to put it, discover the reality of the GC movement. Because, I guess because I'm in the UK, we have... It's not a large community, but they are definitely the loudest, and very much... One of them has 10 Twitter accounts, 3 WordPress blogs, and 5 Mumsnet accounts.
Oh my god.
That's the pattern. So it feels like there's thousands of them, but really there's several hundred, maybe, in the UK, who all have a lot of money.
Some of them do. Some of them don't. Some of them have a lot more influence than money. Some of them started out not having much and gained it through the process, I think. Anyway, I try not to talk about specific people, but...
It's okay. I think everyone listening knows who you're talking about, and it's okay. So you're saying that it should be about how we talk to people who are in that community and trying to, I guess, de-radicalize them, I guess?
The people that I listened to were never the people who used regular points, because I was sort of immune to those. I already had thought about them. I didn't agree with them. And I don't know if this will work, but if I was going to be continually political, what I would talk about wasn't necessarily how things are. I would say, well, why don't we then try to take this model that you already have and move it from that model to this other one? Because I think this is going to create a less toxic result. And I think that given all of these different variables, this is a better way to structure society. Because a lot of the question is about maintaining old social structures versus creating new ones, and why. And when I think that when we just say, well, it is like this, then we sort of don't leave as much room as we would like for this is how we can create it. And I think that for a fundamentally creative person, it's a lot more attractive to talk about what we can do rather than how things are.
The one thing I've noticed is a sort of fact immunity. Like, for example, in the UK, as I'm sure you are well aware, there is a narrative in the media that trans people are relatively new and demanding the right to have trans women to have access to women's toilets and vice versa, the other way, trans men in men's toilets. But the truth is, we've had this legal right kind of enshrined since 2003 and absolutely enshrined since 2010, and yet the GC community did not seem to necessarily be as big as it has become over the last 3 years.
JY was a huge catalyst for that, because they were able to take tons and tons of creepy screenshots and then just spread them everywhere. It was a huge, JY was their biggest weapon for a long time.
And still is. Every few days, our Twitter account will get something about JY, get something about KW, if we're going to go with initials. It's always the same 2. They always same 2 or 3. There's usually a third one. Somebody else somewhere in Russia or something. I don't know how you would talk to someone when their reality is so far away from the facts, because they always seem to talk like, if we let them do this, but we've been doing this in practice for 20 years in the UK, and well, legally for 20 years in the UK, and in practice decades longer. Like, you try and tell them that we effectively had self-ID in the 1960s, they won't believe you, but we did. Trans people, transsexuals as they were called back then, could change their birth certificate just by asking, and it would be done. And nobody wants to admit that was the way it was. They want to portray it as a new thing that's going to come and ruin the current structure, when the current structure is not perfect, and GRA reform is just about getting rid of a £140 fee and submitting evidence to a board.
I think there's a point to be made in terms of structure. I think there's a point to be made that the previous structure was held together by a very small minority because social prejudice was so strong back then compared to how it is now. We made a lot of inroads, and I think that social prejudice was so much stronger that we had a structure that could have been looser. And I think what they're afraid of in a lot of ways is that the loosening of the social structure is going to bring people out of the woodwork that would be things. So I think that a lot of it's a projection of what it is that they feel could happen based on this new thing. They think they're in new territory, even though really they're not.
Yeah, they're really not, because that's the thing. The Republic of Ireland has had self-ID for the last 5 years. The rates of sexual assault haven't really changed that much at all. Well within the usual bell curve, you know what I mean? Like, there are countries that have self-ID right now. Denmark has it, Malta has it, Argentina has it. And they never ever point to them or any problem that has come up in those countries. So when you say that we need to find a new way to get around the table with them, I don't know if I can agree, because they seem to be immune to facts. Because they're always saying about hypotheticals and never anything that's actually happened, except JY, which is the first one they found by the sounds of it.
It's not the first one they found. It's just the most poignant example, because the only one I know of that was taking photographs in the bathroom where there was little kids. A part of this is not that you don't want to necessarily, like, when you're talking to people and you're trying to communicate with someone, there's a difference between trying to establish a basis of communication and trying to talk about, like, the facts. And so every side has a fact they hold on to and that they defend. It's the hill that they're going to die on, right? And a lot of times with gender criticals, they have a basic like idea of what the facts are, and then they wrap their arguments around that, right? And the same thing happens a little bit on the trans side as well, because we sort of like, well, no, this is the worldview that we feel. This is what we live. This is reality for us, right? And so we wrap our analysis around that. But to them, they can't see or experience it, so they don't take that as fact. They think it's conjecture, or they think it's just feeling.
But I wasn't talking about conjecture or what I
no,
feel.
You're talking about
it's true. Self-ID has existed in many countries for years and hasn't caused any of the problems they say it has.
No.
Hell, even the JY case went to court. The court said no. The system worked, and they turned that into an argument against that system. It was so bizarre to me.
So we're going to have to start wrapping up, but Haven, we haven't heard from you in a while. Do you have any final thoughts for us?
Love and acceptance are the bottom lines. And as someone who is a recovering modernist and a former positivist, and someone who's kind of come to a more postmodern viewpoint on social topics, I'll say, I just kind of got to the same point that Asha got to, which was that I'm just going to, where I said that I was going to suspend disbelief and just accept that this is how people identify, this is how people live their lives, this is how I'm going to see them. And then, so I just had to accept, trans women are women, trans men are men, non-binary people are non-binary, and agender people are agender. And the same courtesy that I showed to them, I showed to myself as well. And I had to say that I accept my lack of gender identity, I accept my physical transition, I accept my journey, and I accept who I am. Even if the world doesn't, even if a lot of people think that I'm a horrible person because I've transitioned, or because I've left the GC movement, or because I accept, trans women as women, trans men as men, it doesn't matter. This is this is an ethical issue for me. And it always comes down to love. And last thing I'm going to say as well is when it comes to the subject of women's rights and how, trans rights interact with women's rights and all of that, I feel like that's a very valid discussion to be had. I don't feel like the GC side is ready to sit down and have the conversation with the trans side because they're just so stuck on a very rigid, very uncompromising worldview and belief system that omits no exceptions. And so it just becomes a very difficult conversation. And there's no evidence that trans women are a threat to women in bathrooms or in anything like in any spaces such as that. And so I feel like acceptance should be the position. Let people use whichever spaces they feel most comfortable in. And lastly, I'm not an activist. I've asked that my face not be shown. I've asked that my new accounts not be advertised because I don't want attention out of this. I'm someone who basically, goes hiking and plays RPGs and writes fiction, and that's it. I don't do trans advocacy in real life. I don't do trans advocacy online. I don't even talk about trans topics. Like this interview has been the first time I've mentioned the trans issue in months. But I'm just saying that for those of you who are brave enough to get out and to advocate and to support your community, thank you. I'm so grateful to you. Thank you.
I mean, thank you for coming on and talking to us, and thank you for being so honest and so great, Haven. Seriously, thank you.
Asha, where can people find you on social media? Because you said that you were okay with sharing that and being public. So where can people find you?
Yeah, I figure I'm already public enough. It's just going to be what it is. And I'm hoping people will like my artwork as I'm going forward. So I'm going to take the opportunity to try and promote a little, if that's okay. So you can find me on Twitter at Kinesis, so KINYSIS.
Cool. Okay, there'll be a link in the description so you can follow Asha and her art. Haven, Asha, thank you very much for coming on the show.
Thank you so much for having me and for the interest you all have shown in this topic and in everything that we do. And I really just hope that what we said and talked about is helpful for people. I hope that in some ways it gives you all some food for thought, so that if anything, just a different way of looking at things.
To the trans listeners, I apologize for ever being a mouthpiece for transphobia. I was for several years. It was far too long, and I just ask your forgiveness. I humbly and completely, sincerely apologize. And to the gender critical community, I understand why you may be upset. There really isn't anything that I can say that will make you feel better about this or that will cause you to understand. So I'm just going to say, be well, take care of yourselves. It's a dangerous world out there. Like just be kind to yourselves and hopefully just have long, happy, fulfilling lives. That's what I want for you. It's just long, happy, fulfilling lives, being yourself and feeling safe and feeling loved. And that's what I want.
Well, yeah, and thanks so much to both of you for coming on and sharing your stories with us, particularly when they're so intense and personal. Thank you so much for doing that, and stay safe, of course.
So what was of no surprise to me, because this is something that I have kind of suspected for a while, is there seems to be a pattern. In this particular case with these two in particular, there was a very, very strong pattern of finding people who are maybe a little bit vulnerable and sort of bringing them into the fold and showing them love. And I have a horrible feeling that that is something that they have done many, many times before to cis people and trans people.
Indeed. I don't think these are the only people in a hate movement who work like that. I actually think that that's how quite a lot of such groups recruit. It's like the love bombing element that we mentioned, but the kind of, as soon as you start talking to them, they sort of try closing you off to everybody else. And say, oh, well, this is the case. Here are our tenets. And then you try and talk about those tenets to somebody outside of that little bubble, and they say, no, that's ridiculous. That's awful. Why would you say that? And then they get welcomed back and say, oh God, everybody outside this bubble is so mean, aren't they? And it's obviously that's how new religious movements co-opt individuals. And I think it was one of the things that did not take me aback, really, was that exact strategy, because that is what it is, being used in this context. It's hard, isn't it?
Yes, but I do want to say something to the listeners. Asha and Haven, they're very, very brave to come and talk to us. And I want to, again, thank them for coming to talk to us. And don't seek them out and give them shit, because it sounds like they've had a horrible old time of things. And I think that in the same circumstances, there is part of me that probably would have done the same thing. And I think that is true for many of the people listening, even if you don't believe that, because the problem with hate movements is they get you when you're at a weak point, and they give you what you kind of want. They give you a very simplified version of the world, them bad, us good, and sometimes you need that. There's part of that, which is the reason why I love the films of the Marvel Cinematic Universe.
Absolutely.
As much as I do. So compassion and empathy for these two is real, and I think that we should try and cautiously but also empathetically get them back into the fold if that is what they want. And Haven does not want to be bothered about any of this, but you could find links to Ash's stuff in the description. Please don't send them shit, because they've dealt with enough. And I would hate...
And it doesn't really achieve anything.
It doesn't achieve anything, but I hate their bravery of speaking out on this to be rewarded with hate that they don't need.
Yeah, exactly. And I think why this is so valuable is for that observation you've just given, which is this is kind of how hate movements work. And to have seen that from the inside as one of the people that it's kind of directed at, it just... it's never too far away. And so for those people to come here and talk about those things that happened and the thought processes that led to it is, as you say, it's genuinely quite a brave thing to do. And you'll see Hope Not Hate and other groups saying, that they've spoken to people who were formerly part of hate groups, and it's difficult. And it's, you only realise afterwards just how far down the rabbit hole you went, in a sense, and the harm that could have been caused by that. So there's not much to be achieved by harassing either of these people further. But I think that's the last thing I will say on that. How about you? Do you think?
Yeah, I think we've made the point clear. Don't be dicks.
Yeah, pretty much.
Basically, we are open to all except dicks, so don't be dicks.
And thus far, most of our listeners, turns out, are not dicks. So we would love for that trend to continue.
Also, by the time this comes out, I'll have a thing in iNews, which is something. So there'll be a link to that as well. So give that a check and give that a read. Send it to your cis friends, because I wrote it for cis people. So send it on to your cis friends. It is about the Liz Truss stuff, and we'll probably be back on the Liz Truss train very shortly. But I thought I'd give myself a little plug because I got in a fucking paper, Ashleigh.
Absolutely, as well you might. I mean, I talk about my band often enough, so yeah, fucking check it on out. The iNewspaper.
But yeah, check me out. But also, you should check out our social media, that thing that you do every day that ruins your day. But not because you follow our social media, because our social media is incredible, I like to think. You can get us on Twitter at WhatTheTrans. You can get us on Instagram at WhatTheTrans. You can get us on Facebook /WhatTheTrans. And you can get us on the oldstyle.com internet thing, whatthetrans.com for blogs and other stuff. And also see our faces, maybe, if you like.
Yeah, if that's something that you're particularly into. So yes, you can join us in all the usual places on social medias. And of course, all those social medias do contain a link to our Patreon. Patreon.com/whatthetrans, or you can find a link from our website.
Yeah, donate some cash, because we're going to be giving out stickers soon. And there's also a tier where I'd come on Zoom and teach you how to make balloon animals.
I love stickers. Apart from when they're the transphobic kind of stickers, they're rubbish.
There's been a lot less of them now, because nobody can go outside.
Yeah, I know. That's a plus, I suppose.
Yeah. Anyway, that's our show. Thank you very much for listening. Stay safe, stay indoors, wash your mitts, and don't hug anyone who's coughing. Have a good one. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
So this episode of What the Trans was written and produced by Michelle O'Toole and Ashley Talbot.
And was produced by Joe Ross Barrett.
And this episode was edited by myself, Michelle O'Toole, and Joe Ross Barrett.
And also thank you to our Patreons. Alexandra Lilly,
Anthony Pena,
April Heller,
Becky Scott Fairley,
Bernard's Pink Jellybean,
Cassius Adair,
Chris Hubley,
Claire Scott,
Derek Victor,
Desiree Markland,
Elliot McVeigh,
Emma Doyle,
Ian Coomber,
Karakan 12,
Catherine,
Laker,
Lauren O'Nyons,
Lewis Brown,
Lanos,
Maddie Bell,
Matt Reynolds,
Melissa Brooks,
Mike Dickinson,
Mina,
Molly,
Patreon user,
Samantha Alice Raven,
Sarah the taxi driver Halliwell,
and Sophie Lewis. Thank you so much to all of you, and we will speak to you again soon.